A 32-year-old man is in police custody after allegedly murdering his father, cutting off his head and displaying it on camera during a 14-minute rant on YouTube in which he espoused right-wing conspiracy theories. Justin Mohn of Levittown, a suburb just outside of Philadelphia, has been officially charged with first-degree murder and abusing a corpse. At the time of his arrest, he was armed and had just jumped a fence at a National Guard facility roughly 100 miles away from his home. Police said he did not resist arrest. His father, Michael Mohn, was a federal employee who worked for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. In the video rant that Justin Mohn posted on YouTube, which remained live on the site for hours, he held up his father's decapitated head and declared him a traitor to his country. The video was taken down several hours later, but it was viewed more than 5,000 times before it was removed. Among the various rantings in the video were extremist right-wing conspiracy theories regarding the Biden administration, immigration and the border, urban crime, and the war in Ukraine. Mohn also declared himself the new acting U.S. president under martial law before calling for the bloody execution of all federal employees, whom he also deemed traitors. The grisly case is disturbing in its own right, but experts are also concerned about what this gruesome act of violence could signify for the upcoming political season. Around 7 p.m. on January 30th, Michael Mohn's wife, Denise, returned home to discover her husband's body lying in their bathroom. The couple's adult son, Justin, was nowhere to be found, nor was Michael Mohn's car or head. Denise Mohn called the police, who arrived at the scene and discovered a large kitchen knife and machete in the bathtub. According to an affidavit, officers also located the deceased male's head inside of a plastic bag, which was inside of a cooking pot in a first-floor bedroom next to the bathroom, the affidavit says. Shortly thereafter, police were made aware of the YouTube video posted by Justin Mohn. He identifies himself in the video and appears to be reading from a pre-written statement. At one point in the video, he holds up a clear plastic bag, inside which is his father's head. He identifies his father, Michael Mohn, as a 20-year federal employee and a traitor. Michael Mohn was an engineer with the Geo-Environmental Section of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Philadelphia District. America is rotting from the inside out as far left. Woke mobs rampage our once prosperous cities, Justin Mohn says in the video. In a statement, YouTube said the video was removed for violating the site's graphic violence policy. It also terminated Justin Mohn's channel in accordance with YouTube's violent extremism policies. Our teams are closely tracking to remove any re-uploads of the video, YouTube said. Justin Mohn reportedly has a history of extremist and paranoid beliefs. As the Associated Press notes, Mohn threatened and harassed employees at a Colorado Springs credit union, where he was previously employed. He threatened to sue the business for $10 million unless it agreed to a $2 million settlement. He also said he would make false statements to provoke police to attack its employees, which he planned to film. While employed, Mohn accused co-workers of tampering with evidence in a disciplinary matter against him. Co-workers also identified lines from a song or poem written by Mohn as threatening. The title of the piece was "Men Don't Get No Warning Shots." Mohn's former roommate, Davis Rebhan, said that while the two were living together around 2016, he often heard Mohn proclaiming wild conspiracy theories. Even back then, he had very clear issues. He would always talk about how the government was out to get him, and it was always like these vague stories about it, Rebhan stated. He would never give specific examples. He would tell me these stories that always seemed exaggerated, so it was hard to take anything he was saying seriously, or know what he was saying the truth about. The two lived together for about a year, during which Mohn only ever received a single visitor, his father. "I got nothing from that visit that would have made me ever think this would happen," Rebhan recalled. Later, Mohn sued Progressive Insurance after he was fired. alleging that he had been discriminated against for being a man who was intelligent, overqualified, and overeducated. A federal judge said Mohn provided no evidence to indicate that this was true. Rather, the company said he was fired for kicking open a door. According to Rebhan, it wasn't out of character for Mohn to violently lash out. At one point, he had a hysterical fit and smashed the apartment, Rebhan said. I wasn't home when he did it, so I don't know what triggered it. But we had a long conversation after that, and he told me he had undiagnosed PTSD. Mohn's case is certainly a disturbing outlier, but some experts fear that there are others like Mohn who could be provoked to violence due to deeply politicized, extreme rhetoric. The bigger picture is extremely concerning, I think, as we go into what will be an incredibly heated political season. CNN law enforcement analyst and former FBI deputy director Andrew McCabe said, "It is fair to assume that Mohn was clearly motivated by politics, as evidenced by his video diatribe. The larger concern, according to McCabe, is that the sorts of things Mohn said are reflective of overheated, deeply politicized, extreme rhetoric that you hear sometimes in this country from politically elected officials and leaders." McCabe raised concerns that this kind of rhetoric could have a genuine impact on marginalized people, with extremist views who might be driven to embark in acts of violence. Given that 2024 is sure to be a heated year politically, with the upcoming presidential election, stories like Mohn's serve as an example of how the propagation of extremist conspiracy theories and violent rhetoric can impact vulnerable and violent portions of the population. Chilling CCTV shows the horrifying moment a vicious sex predator prowled the streets of London for targets before he became fixated on aspiring lawyer Zara Aleena and murdered her, just 9 days after the savage thug had been released from jail. Jordan McSweeney ambushed Zara Aleena and punched her in the back of the head before dragging the 35-year-old into a driveway and kicking her as she lay on the ground as she went home on a night out in June of 2022. As the law graduate lay dying, the brute sexually assaulted her, then grabbed her handbag, mobile phone, and keys. He then walked away but returned moments later to deliver the fatal final blows. Prosecutor Oliver Glasgow King's counsel said that McSweeney, also 35, launched an attack upon a lone female late at night, making her way home, a woman who stood no chance. The thug stood in the dock today and stared at the floor as he entered his guilty pleas, while Mrs. Aleena's family looked on. At a previous hearing, the court was told McSweeney was a prolific offender and had been released from prison on license on June 17th, just days before the murder. He had been in prison for criminal damage, racially aggravated harassment, and unauthorized possession of a knife in prison. He has 28 convictions for 69 separate offenses, including burglary, theft of a vehicle, criminal damage, assaulting police officers, and assaulting members of the public while on bail. 2 days before the murder, McSweeney's license was revoked for failing to keep appointments with probation services. But the recall request was still being processed, and police had yet to be informed he was to be arrested. Earlier on the night of the murder, he had been caught on CCTV following other women through the streets before he became fixated on Zara, a popular student who was caring for her mother and grandmother. Mr. Glasgow told the court the defendant has been charged in connection with the violent death of Zara, who was attacked in the early hours of the morning of 26 June. Witnesses and CCTV footage identified McSweeney as the person who carried out the savage and brutal attack. He can be seen on CCTV footage following and observing a number of different women, obviously interested in them and their movements. Mr. Glasgow said, "Tragically, for Zara Aleena, it was her on whom he became fixated. Having dragged her into the driveway of number 268, he forced her around, and then he is seen kicking and stomping repeatedly on her body. Mrs. Aleena's screams woke up nearby residents, who frantically dialed 999. When she was discovered, she was already fatally wounded from the onslaughts. She was bleeding, struggling to breathe, had clearly sustained serious head injuries, and was also partially naked, the prosecutor said. Police and paramedics attended and attempted to give life-saving first aid to her, but the injuries that she had sustained were so severe that nothing could be done to save her. She was taken to hospital at around 4:30 a.m. and was declared dead shortly afterwards. Mrs. Aleena, who had recently started work at the Royal Courts of Justice, died from severe head injuries. CCTV tracked McSweeney to the caravan he lived in, and police found him there. During a search, officers found blood-stained clothing and shoes, which matched those seen on the attacker on CCTV. McSweeney is further linked to the attack through forensic evidence. Blood staining found on the wall at Cranbrook Road contained finger marks that matched his fingerprint. This proves beyond any doubt, we suggest, that this defendant followed, attacked, and brutally murdered Zara Aleena, Mr. Glasgow said. McSweeney was questioned by police and sat in silence throughout all 3 interviews, refusing to even confirm his personal details. All he said was that he had ADHD and split personality disorder. While in custody, he was also said to have threatened police officers. Having been charged with murder, he was remanded into custody after a judge found he was a substantial risk to the public, especially lone women. Zara's family described her as independent, big-hearted, and a joy. Her aunt Farah Naz had said her niece had been conscious of the dangers for women after the murders of Bibea Henry, Nicole Smallman, Sarah Everard, and Sabina Nessa, but she had felt safe walking in the community where she was well known. Mrs. Naz said, Zara was not a woman who was unaware that there were dangers in the world. She did not imagine what happened to those women would happen to her. She didn't know she was going to be on this list because in her mind, she took those precautions. Zara had begun working at the Royal Courts of Justice 5 weeks before her death, and was the happiest she had ever been, her family said. McSweeney's plea hearing had been delayed after the defendant caught COVID in custody. His barrister, George Carter Stevenson KC, said he is still feeling unwell from COVID, but realizes the importance of being here today. Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb adjourned sentencing until December 14th. She told McSweeney, "You pleaded guilty to very serious matters. I'm sure you appreciate the kind of sentence you will receive. But I will listen very carefully to the Crown's opening of the case and the submissions on your behalf, so it's in your interests to cooperate with those representing you." After the hearing, Senior Crown Prosecutor Olkay Sapanoglu welcomed the pleas, saying it was a horrific attack on a woman walking home after a night out with a friend. It appears clear that McSweeney was intent that night on finding a woman to attack. Having seen Zara walking home, he decided to follow her. Having followed her for several minutes, he pulled Zara into the driveway of a house where he carried out his assault. He sexually assaulted her, then brutally stomped on her several times before appearing to walk away. Moments later, he returned, only to stamp on her several times more, and then, finally, leaving her for dead. McSweeney did not display a shred of humanity toward Zara. Indeed, having completed his initial assault, he returned to inflict further injuries, leading to her death. At no stage during his police interviews did he express any sorrow for his actions. Zara's family will never recover from the senseless loss of their daughter, but I hope that these guilty pleas bring them some comfort. Finally, I would like to pay tribute to the police, who worked tirelessly to trace Zara's killer, allowing us to build the strongest case possible against McSweeney. McSweeney will be sentenced at the Old Bailey on December 14th. Speaking outside court, Detective Chief Inspector Dave Wellams said Mrs. Aleena was a beloved friend and family member. He said, "She was attacked while walking alone on a residential street. She had every right to be there. She had every right to feel safe. Instead, she was a victim of shocking violence. My thoughts are with her family and her friends. I cannot imagine the pain that they've experienced over the past 5 to 6 months. It is clear she was truly loved by all those that knew her. Tackling violence against women and girls and tracking down those who wish them to do harm is amongst the Met's highest priorities. Jordan McQueenie has pleaded guilty today to the most serious offenses. He's clearly a very dangerous individual, and his guilty plea today means that he is certain to serve a considerable period of time behind bars. The ex-girlfriend of murderer Jordan McSweeney has revealed to Mail Online how she endured 4 years of violence and controlling behavior at his hands before summoning up the courage to leave him for good. But Samantha Bryan, 30, now regrets not pressing assault charges against the wannabe gangster, who went on to kill aspiring lawyer Zara Aleena earlier this year. Mrs. Bryan told Mail Online that McSweeney once stamped on her so badly, it left an imprint of his trainer on her face, just as he did to Mrs. Aleena, who suffered fatal head injuries. Speaking exclusively to Mail Online, Mrs. Bryan told how violent McSweeney, 29, left the mark across her right eye socket and cheek after a savage beating. Describing going to the police, she said, "I gave them a statement, telling them just what he'd done, but I dropped the charges. I just couldn't go through with it. At the time, my thinking was that I'd at last got rid of him from my life, after 4 horrible years, and I was still scared he or one of his acolytes would seek some sort of vengeance. Knowing what he did to the poor woman in Ilford, I wish I had gone ahead with it. Jordan is nothing more than a wannabe gangster with no respect whatsoever for women. I hope he's locked up for the rest of his life. No woman is safe around him." McSweeney would also punch, kick, and bite her, and once threw her out into the street after snatching her phone, forcing her to borrow a mobile from a homeless man so she could call her mother to pick her up. And Mrs. Bryan, who became pregnant by McSweeney, also told how he would cynically cuddle up to her at night, only in order to hide her wounds from his aunt when the young couple stayed with her. McSweeney today admitted the murder and sexual assault of Zara Aleena as she walked home through Ilford, East London in June. Mrs. Aleena, 35, died after suffering traumatic injuries after she was punched in the back of the head and stomped on before McSweeney tried to sexually assault her. The sickening details of her gruesome death sent a shiver down Mrs. Bryan's spine as she revealed, "I know just was a nasty, horrible monster he really is. My heart goes out to her. My only hope now is that nobody else has to suffer at his hands. And he's put away for the rest of his life." Mrs. Bryan, from Strood, Kent, first met McSweeney in 2007 when she was just 15, and he had recently moved to the area from Dagenham, East London. At first, she said she found him charming and funny, but it did not take long for the mask to slip. She told Mail Online, "I thought he was nice to begin with, but he soon showed his true character, and I began to realize it was all an act. He pretty quickly started to control what I did, and if I ever stood up to him, I'd pay the price for it. I moved in with him when I was nearly 17, and I lived with him, his mom and mom's partner, at their home in Rochester. Jordan always expected me to stay at home. He hated me going out without him. Yet he would disappear for hours, sometimes days on end, and wouldn't tell me where was going or where he'd been. There was one time when he came home after a few days away somewhere. I heard him at the door, and I shouted down to him from an upstairs window, asking him where he'd been. He exploded with fury. He literally kicked the door off its hinges and raced up the stairs. I ran to his mother's room at the top and tried to hide there, but he found me and punched and kicked me. I instinctively curled up into a ball, and he continued attacking me until he physically grew tired and stopped. That was the first time he really weighed into me, but it wouldn't be the last. Mrs. Bryan fell pregnant with McSweeney's baby in 2010 when she was aged 18. Tragically, she lost the child. Soon after, the couple moved 20 miles away to Dagenham, East London, to stay with his aunt. However, life did not improve. In fact, it got worse. As McSweeney's rages continued, Mrs. Bryan recalled, "We had one argument. Jordan had become even more volatile and violent. I think he was accusing me of cheating on him. He beat me up, and when he'd finished punching and kicking me, he grabbed my phone out of my hands and threw me out of his aunt's house. I didn't know anyone else in Dagenham, and it was far away from my family home, and I had no means of calling anyone to pick me up. I had no money on me, and in the end, I had to ask a homeless man to borrow his phone and call my mom to come and collect me." Mrs. Bryan said she foolishly accepted McSweeney's apologies and assurances that he had changed, and she moved back in with him. However, there was to be one more violent row in May 2011 that would bring her to her senses and leave him for good. She said, "Jordan had again gone missing for a couple of days and left me at his auntie's house while he was out gallivanting. When he eventually returned, we started rowing about it in the bedroom, and then he switched. He punched me to the floor, bit my arm, and started kicking me. He stomped on my face with such force that you could see the imprint of his trainer on my face the following morning. I thought he'd blinded me to begin with because I had trouble seeing out of my right eye immediately afterwards. The most sickening aspect was that later that night he climbed into bed with me and cuddled up to me to force me away from the door in the room. I know he only did that because his aunt would sometimes come in before she went to bed, if we'd had a row and check everything was all right. He obviously didn't want her to see what he'd done to me. But when I went downstairs the following morning, she took one look at me and gasped and asked if Jordan had done that. When I told her that he had, she told me, "Listen, you have to leave him and get as far away from him as you possibly can." I left him there and then and never saw him again. In 1991, a Michigan man named Gregory Green brutally murdered his pregnant wife, stabbing her several times in the face and chest, and killing his unborn child in the process. But 16 years after being incarcerated for this crime, Green seemed to have turned a corner. He had a nearly spotless prison record, and friends and family members wrote letters to the parole board advocating for his release, insisting he had changed. He was finally released on parole for good behavior in 2008. But in 2016, history would repeat itself in the most tragic way imaginable. On a dark September night, Green killed his 2 young children, aged 4 and 5, by poisoning them with exhaust fumes as they slept in his car. That same evening, he bound his teenage stepchildren and then shot them in the head in front of their terrified mother. Gregory Green had murdered his family a second time. Gregory Green was born on December 10, 1966, and was raised in a religious family. Other than that, not much is known about his childhood. By the time Green hit his early 20s, he had met Tanya Clayton Green. The two fell in love and were married. Tanya had 2 young children from a previous relationship. Before long, she became pregnant with Gregory's child, and it seemed as though the couple were beginning to build a family together. But things took a dark turn when Gregory's behavior became increasingly controlling and violently aggressive towards Tanya. Alarmed by the shift, Tanya confided in a friend that she planned to leave Gregory. She never got the chance. Instead, on July 14, 1991, Gregory Green attacked his wife in their Detroit home. In a fit of rage, he grabbed a steak knife from the kitchen and brutally stabbed Tanya 10 times in the neck, cheek, chest, and back. She was 6 months pregnant at the time. Both Tanya and the unborn child tragically died. Luckily, Tanya's 2 young children, aged 5 and 8, were miraculously out of harm's way during the attack. After it was all over, Gregory dialed 911 and calmly told officers what he had done. When the police arrived, he opened the door and welcomed them inside. "I stabbed her," he said. "She's in the kitchen." Then, he showed them to the refrigerator where he'd stashed the murder weapon. In 1992, Gregory Green pleaded no contest to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 15 to 25 years in prison. Prison records indicate that he showed no signs of remorse or empathy for the murders, instead shifting blame on Tanya for his actions. He was denied parole 4 times. Still, Green maintained a virtually spotless prison record, with only one minor altercation with another inmate. He steered clear of prison violence and kept a low profile throughout his time behind bars. Meanwhile, family, friends, and even corrections officers wrote letters to the parole board advocating for his release, insisting he had changed and become closer to God. "We believe Gregory is very sorry for what he did and has gained insight into his behaviors," his parents wrote in November 2006. "He has worked hard in prison, and he continues to make a positive adjustment." Fred Harris, a pastor of the Church of Risen Christ Ministries International in Detroit, who'd known Green before the murders, wrote multiple letters to the Michigan Parole Board on Green's behalf, begging them to give him a second chance and promising that the church would help with his rehabilitation. "Gregory and I were friends before his mishap, and he was incarcerated," Harris wrote. "He was a member of our church. I feel he has paid for his unfortunate lack of self-control and the damage he has caused as much as possible, and is sorry." With the help of Pastor Harris, Green was finally released on parole in 2008. 2 years later, on December 18, 2010, he married Pastor Harris' daughter, Faith. Faith Green had 2 children from a previous marriage, Chadney Allen Jr. and Kara Allen. During their 6-year marriage, Gregory and Faith welcomed 2 more daughters, Coe and Callie Green. But by 2013, Gregory had begun to subject Faith to the same abuse he had inflicted upon his first wife, Tanya. Faith had reportedly tried to leave him multiple times and even filed for divorce that year. According to reports, she tried to get a personal protection order against her husband in 2013, claiming he would often get belligerent, kicking things and threatening to attack her. On one occasion, she claimed, "Gregory told her things are going to get ugly if she didn't leave the house." She also claimed he had kicked the couch while one of their babies was sleeping on it. At the time, the court denied her personal protection order request, citing insufficient allegations. Faith remained with her husband for another 3 years, but in August 2016, Faith Green once again found herself filing for divorce. On the night of September 21, 2016, Gregory Green turned on his family once again. That night, he brutally assaulted his wife in the basement of their home. He tied her up with zip ties and duct tape and proceeded to terrorize her, slashing her face with a knife and shooting her in the foot. The horror continued as Green brought his 2 teenage stepchildren, Chadney, 19, and Kara, 17, downstairs. He then forced Faith to witness as he tied her children up and shot them each in the head, execution style. That night, Green put his 2 youngest children, Coe and Kaylee, into the family car and snaked a hose from the car's tailpipe into the car's interior, poisoning the little girls with deadly carbon monoxide from the exhaust fumes. Then, he carried their lifeless bodies back into the house and placed them back in their beds. As he had done the first time he murdered his family, Gregory Green called the police on himself and readily admitted to what he had done. When the police arrived, he was waiting for them outside on the driveway. In February 2017, Gregory Green was sentenced to 45 to 100 years in prison for the murders, plus 6 to 10 years for additional charges. By the time he is eligible for release, he will be 97. Faith Green spoke at his sentencing, telling the court that she suffers from migraines and nightmares after witnessing the deaths of her children. "Sometimes I dream of the night all this happened and wake up screaming and sweating, thinking that I can save my children somehow," she said. Then I realized that the nightmare is actually reality, and that my children are really gone. I tried to find the strength to start my day somehow. There's no punishment that fits the crime, she told Gregory in court. Not even torture and death would do justice. Your justice will come when you burn in hell for all eternity. He responded, It's in God's hands. Only He can judge. You know, I do regret, and I'm sorry for what has happened. Faith Green's 4 children were given a joint funeral. During the service, Faith gave the pastor a simple statement to read. My dear babies, it read, I loved you all. The mystery surrounding the disappearance of University of Virginia student Hannah Graham led to a month-long national search effort for her captor. The British-born college student was abducted and murdered after an evening out, and the prime suspect, dubbed the back-to-school killer, admitted he killed her as well as a second co-ed. On the evening of September 12, 2014, University of Virginia sophomore Hannah Graham, 18, attended a house party in Charlottesville and later texted friends that she was lost. That same night, Jesse Matthew Jr., a 32-year-old former hospital orderly and cab driver, was spotted at multiple area bars, where he was accused of groping several women. He began his night at the Lazy Parrot Bar in Charlottesville, where witnesses said he approached a woman sitting alone at the bar and continued to make advances towards her. Even after she told him she had a boyfriend, Matthew asked for her phone number, told her how nice her lips were, and repeatedly touched her hands, making her uncomfortable enough that she sat on her hands to prevent him from continuing to touch her. Another witness said Matthew looked at her in a crazy way after he grabbed her leg, and she told him not to touch her. According to a statement of facts from the Albemarle County Commonwealth Attorney's Office, one of the women told investigators Matthew approached her after she took off her boots because her feet were hurting. She said Matthew grabbed her foot, took off her sock, and touched her foot, despite her protests, telling her a woman that takes care of her feet takes care of everything else. One witness who confronted Matthew about his behavior told investigators. Matthew replied, he was just trying to meet girls. At another bar, Rapture, prosecutors say Matthew grabbed the buttocks of a former acquaintance without her consent. The woman hid from Matthew behind another person standing nearby, and Matthew tried to grab her again. The documents say, another person confronted him about his behavior, and Matthew closed out his tab there shortly after 1 a.m. Around the same time, Graham had been seen on surveillance images walking unsteadily in the same area. The documents say she had been drinking. She texted friends throughout the evening, but her texts became increasingly difficult to understand, consistent with an increasing level of impairment. At one point, she had texted a friend that she was lost. Around 1 a.m., Matthew, then 32, left the bar Rapture, and surveillance video on a downtown pedestrian mall captured footage of him passing by Graham. She appeared intoxicated and unsteady on her feet. He turned and began to follow Graham, and a bystander pointed out that Matthew didn't appear to know her. Hush, Matthew responded, according to the court document. The bystander and a second witness then followed the pair into Tempo and noted Matthew had ordered drinks for himself and the underage Graham. A short time later, around 1:18 a.m., a third witness, the last to see Graham alive that evening, recalled seeing the teenager back on the street, walking ahead of Matthew, who did not look friendly as he caught up to the student and put his arm around her. According to the third witness, Matthew then guided Graham to the passenger side of his nearby orange Chrysler Sebring, and Graham's voice sounded elevated, rapid, and frightened, as if she did not know Matthew when she refused to get into the vehicle. Matthew and Graham were gone when the witness drove past the spot where Matthew's vehicle had been parked 2 minutes earlier. According to court documents, in the days that followed Graham's disappearance, Matthew's colleagues told investigators he had a swollen jaw, acted very, very not himself, and very weird and told them he was not okay. The documents also outline physical evidence investigators collected against Matthew in Graham's murder. They say DNA that is likely Graham's was discovered on his shorts and on the interior passenger side door of his car. They also say that Matthew's car was seen between 6:30 and 7:30 that morning, near the rural vacant property, where Graham's skeletonized remains would be discovered 5 weeks later, about 12 miles southwest from where she was last seen. Found with Graham's remains were the crop top she was last seen wearing, which was unzipped and inside out, and her jeans, which were also inside out and had holes that hadn't been there when she was last seen. Investigators found her watch nearby, but her undergarments, shoes, and cell phone were never recovered, the documents say. A medical examiner ruled the young woman's death the result of homicidal violence, likely by suffocation, or strangulation because she didn't suffer significant trauma to her skull. Graham had 2 nasal fractures that likely occurred at or near her time of death, the documents say. Matthew was quickly identified as the prime suspect in the case. Police executed a search warrant on his car September 19th, and the documents say he wasn't responsive to police's questions about Graham, saying only when asked if she had been in his car. He reportedly approached multiple detectives about retrieving paperwork for a passport out of his car before it was towed away. Police arrested him in Galveston, Texas, on September 24, 2014. Several weeks later, Graham's skeletonized remains were located behind a vacant lot around 12 miles from downtown Charlottesville. DNA evidence connected Matthew to Graham's murder, but investigators also were able to tie him to 2 other unsolved crimes, a 2005 abduction and rape in Fairfax, and the murder of 20-year-old Virginia Tech student Morgan Dana Harrington 4 years later. On October 17, 2009, Harrington attended a Metallica concert at Charlottesville's John Paul Jones Arena. She exited the arena and wasn't allowed to re-enter, so she began to hitchhike in the area where Matthew was driving a cab. Harrington's remains were found on farmland in January 2010, and Matthew's DNA was tied to forensic evidence on the victim's t-shirt, which was located months earlier not far from the arena, authorities said. In March 2016, Matthew took a plea deal to avoid the death penalty and admitted to abducting and murdering both Graham and Harrington. A judge sentenced him to 4 consecutive life terms in prison for the slayings, and he is also serving 3 life terms in connection with the rape in Fairfax. In a victim impact statement at Matthew's sentencing, Graham's mother, Sue, said her daughter was a heroine who helped capture a serial rapist and murderer who had been hiding in plain sight in Charlottesville for years. Six-year-old JonBenét Ramsey was brutally murdered in her Colorado home in 1996. Police have been puzzled as to who might have killed the child pageant star. Over the years, they investigated her parents, her brother, an electrician, a former school teacher named John Mark Carr, and the family's housekeeper. But one of the most compelling suspects is a man named Gary Oliva. In 2019, Gary, a convicted sex offender, seemingly confessed to JonBenét's murder in a series of disturbing jailhouse letters and poems, claiming he killed the 6-year-old by accident. Oliva had been obsessed with JonBenét for years and had had hundreds of images of the 6-year-old on his phone when he was arrested in 2016. What's more, Oliva had lived near JonBenét at the time of her murder and even attended a vigil for the 1-year anniversary of her death. But to this day, Gary Oliva has never been charged with the murder. Born on January 7, 1964, Gary Howard Oliva grew up in California. Former classmates in high school called him Scary Gary. They later reported he'd often behave erratically, doing strange things like deliberately burning himself or running screaming through the streets. He sometimes made disturbing jokes about necrophilia. Notably, he also reportedly had a fascination with knots and a bizarre habit of breaking into homes to steal art supplies. After high school, Oliva started exchanging audio cassette tapes with his former classmate Michael Vale as a way to keep in touch. At first, Vale says, the recordings were playful and innocent. However, in 1989, Oliva's tapes began to devolve into something more sinister. In one recording, Oliva reportedly pretends to be babysitting a friend's daughter and jokes about raping her. On another tape, he fantasizes about cooking and eating children. The tapes started getting darker, more depraved, and sicker. "It would turn my stomach," Vale stated in 2002. Some of the tapes, Vale said, were smeared with blood. He also claims Oliva sent him packages containing hair and posters of missing girls. Gary Oliva's extensive criminal history dates back nearly 3 decades. In 1990, Oliva was arrested in Oregon for sexually abusing a 7-year-old girl. In May 1991, while on probation for this crime, Oliva threatened to kill his mother, Anne Freitag, attempting to strangle her with a telephone cord at their home in Grants Pass, Oregon. The Oregon Department of Corrections wrote in a report in 2019, during the course of the assault, Oliva threatened his mother, stating, "I should have killed you a long time ago," and made other threats to kill her. He also stated that when the sheriff arrives, they will find you dead. The report goes on to detail how Oliva attacked his mother. Oliva removed a butcher knife from the drawer and had it in his possession. Oliva also pulled a telephone cord loose from a telephone and wrapped it around his mother's neck and began tightening it. Oliva fled the house before the police arrived, but was later caught and arrested. He spent 17 months in jail for the attempted murder and moved to Colorado after his release. Then, in December 1996, a 6-year-old girl was found murdered in her Boulder home. The murder of JonBenét Ramsey on December 26, 1996, has puzzled investigators for decades and remains a headline-grabbing mystery to this day. The 6-year-old beauty pageant star was initially thought to have kidnapped by an intruder when her parents, Patsy and JonBenét Ramsey, woke up to find JonBenét missing from her room and a 3-page handwritten ransom note in the house. Then, her father found JonBenét in the basement of the Ramsey home. She was wrapped up in a blanket, with her mouth covered, her wrists bound, and a cord around her neck. She had died of asphyxiation and a skull fracture. Described as a drifter who frequently wandered the Boulder area, Gary Oliva was reportedly using an address 10 blocks from the Ramsey home at the time of the murder. On the day JonBenét's body was found, Vale claims that Oliva called him sobbing and said, "I just heard a little girl." The following day, news broke of JonBenét's murder. Fearing that Oliva had something to do with the crime, Vale called the Boulder Police Department on December 27th to report the disturbing call he had received from Oliva. But investigators never returned Vale's call, even after Vale followed up months later. As more information came to light about the murder, Vale became more convinced that Oliva was involved. The garrote used to strangle JonBenét had been made from a broken paintbrush and a knotted rope, and Oliva had an obsession with knots and art supplies. 4 years later, in December 2000, Boulder police arrested Gary Oliva on a drug charge. He was found to have a photo of JonBenét Ramsey in his possession, along with a poem titled Ode to JonBenét. Investigators also looked through Oliva's backpack and found a stun gun, one of the weapons theorized to have been used in the crime. For the first time since JonBenét's murder, investigators questioned Oliva about his potential involvement. Initially, he denied having anything to do with it. However, he openly admitted to having an obsession with the child pageant star. "I believe that she came to me after she was killed and revealed herself to me," he said in an interview at the time. "I'd like to see a memorial set up for her. I haven't seen that anywhere." Oliva was cleared of the murder after samples of his DNA were found not to match DNA found at the crime scene. However, very little DNA had been found on the scene in the first place. What's more, the police have been accused of failed to properly secure the crime scene after the murder, possibly destroying or contaminating the evidence in the process. In June 2016, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received a tip from Google that someone in the Boulder area was uploading child pornography. The Gmail account was traced to Oliva. When Boulder police arrested Oliva, they found 695 images on his phone depicting the sexual abuse of children. He also had 335 photographs of and related to JonBenét, including photos of her autopsy. Oliva was sentenced to 10 years in prison for possession of child pornography. 3 years later, he would seemingly confess to being JonBenét Ramsey's killer. In 2019, Gary Oliva sent Michael Vale a series of disturbing letters and poems in which claimed responsibility for JonBenét Ramsey's murder, saying he killed her by accident. "I never loved anyone like I did JonBenét," Oliva wrote in one letter. "And yet, I let her slip, and her head bashed in half, and I watched her die. It was an accident. Please believe me. She was not like the other kids." In these letters, Oliva repeatedly professed his love for the 6-year-old and often likened her to a god. "JonBenét completely changed me and removed all evil from me," he wrote. "Just one look at her beautiful face, her glowing, beautiful skin, and her divine god body. I realized I was wrong to kill other kids. Yet by accident, she died and it was my fault." Vale alerted Boulder authorities to the confessions. After Vale released the letters to the public, private investigator Jason Jensen commissioned 2 handwriting experts, Moselle Martin and Don McCarty, to conduct a forensic analysis of Oliva's letters. In 2023, they found significant similarities between his handwriting and the ransom note discovered inside the Ramsey home before JonBenét's body was found. Martin and McCarty concluded that Oliva most likely authored the Ramsey ransom letter. When you overlay some of those letters and words and letters from different eras of writing, and they line up so well, that's a clear indication in my profession, stated McCarty. But despite this evidence, the police have not charged Oliva with JonBenét's murder. To this day, no one knows for certain who killed JonBenét Ramsey. Although Gary Oliva is a plausible suspect in JonBenét's murder, he has been cleared by DNA testing. Despite multiple confessions, he has never faced any charges related to the murder, and his involvement remains unproven. At the time, Vale released Oliva's confession letters. A Boulder police spokesperson said the department is aware of and has investigated Mr. Oliva's potential involvement in this case. Oliva was originally set to be released from prison in 2025. However, in January 2024, he was released early. He has since been spotted living in a Denver motel and halfway house. For his part, Michael Vale believes Oliva is not capable of reform. "Gary is a danger to society," he said. "This guy needs to stay in jail." In the early morning hours of February 20th, 1987, Terry Wood came home from a night of bowling to discover his wife, Roxanne, dead on the kitchen floor in their home in Niles, Michigan. Detectives say Roxanne Wood had been sexually assaulted and her throat slashed. DNA was preserved from the crime scene, but given technological limitations of the time, there wasn't enough evidence to charge any suspects. The case went cold. Then, 34 years later, investigative genetic genealogist Gabriela Vargas got to work on what had been deemed unsolvable by many because of the scant amount of DNA that was left. Roxanne Wood took on a motherly role with her younger siblings, Brad and Janet. On the evening of February 19, 1987, Roxanne and Terry Wood met at home after work. The couple drove separate cars to a restaurant and had dinner together. Later, they went to a nearby bowling alley where investigators say Terry played in a league. The next day, Roxanne Wood headed home from a night out with friends about 45 minutes before her husband, Terry. When Terry got home, he found Roxanne dead on the kitchen floor. He called local police and said, "My wife has been murdered. She is dead. She has been cut." When investigators from the Michigan State Police arrived at the Wood home, they took photos of the scene, and Terry was questioned by police. Roxanne's body was examined for more evidence. Investigators at the scene found no evidence of forced entry, raising suspicion. According to investigators, Terry also seemed to get belligerent with first responders that night. And when Terry was brought to the station for routine questioning, he quickly asked for an attorney. This set off alarm bells for investigators. Janet Wood stated, an investigator told Terry while looking into Roxanne's murder, "I believe you're the killer, and I will not rest until you're behind bars." Janet Wood says she always knew Terry didn't kill her sister. She added, the possibility of her sister's killer still being out there. "I didn't lose hope ever. I mean, this guy just didn't do this and then lead a clean, pristine life the rest of his life." Due to limitations on technology in 1987, Roxanne Wood's murder case went cold. The Michigan State Police still had a tiny amount of the 1987 DNA evidence from Roxanne's case. In 2020, more than 30 years after Roxanne was killed, they started looking into new ways to solve the case with some innovation. In 2020, Professor Ashlyn Kirsten and students at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan started helping the Michigan State Police with the Roxanne Wood case. The students digitized more than 3,500 pages from the 1987 case file, making it quicker and easier to search through evidence for information. The officers are able to search by name and see if they've already been interviewed, said student Samantha Rogers. Things that they wouldn't be able to do just flipping through thousands of pages. Detective First Lieutenant Chuck Christensen took the investigation a step further and reached out to genetic genealogist and president of Identifinders International, Colleen Fitzpatrick. Her company helps identify unidentified remains and people involved in violent crimes by looking at their DNA. In 2020, Identifinders International started looking into the unidentified DNA left from Roxanne's case. "We found out there was what I would call a gnat's eyebrow of DNA left, about 3% of what we normally use," said Colleen Fitzpatrick. "It really did feel impossible. After about 10 months of testing the small amount of DNA left to solve the Roxanne Wood case, Colleen Fitzpatrick discussed the case with Identifinders International consultant, Gabriela Vargas. After months without success, Fitzpatrick didn't want to disappoint investigators. Vargas looked at the case file and generated a genetic profile from the killer's trace DNA. She then entered the DNA information into an online database. In April 2021, Gabriela Vargas used the online DNA database to start building a family tree of the suspect. That family tree led to a man named Patrick Gilham, who was living in South Bend, Indiana, not far from where Roxanne Wood was killed. Investigators surveilled Gilham with the hope of collecting his DNA. While undercover, Trooper Ryan Codd noticed Gilham was a smoker and knew a cigarette would be a great source for a DNA sample. Trooper Codd picked up Gilham's cigarette after having a conversation with him outside of the laundromat. On July 29, 2021, investigators brought Patrick Gilham in and interviewed him. They told him he wasn't in trouble and that they needed to question him about an old case. Detectives showed Gilham photos of Roxanne and told him she was assaulted. They asked him questions about Roxanne, but Gilham denied knowing her. Soon he said, "I gotta talk to my lawyer, man," and investigators let him go. On February 17, 2022, Patrick Gilham, 67, was arrested and questioned for more than 5 hours. When asked why his DNA was found at the scene, he kept telling investigators, "I have no clue, and I don't remember." Gilham asked for an attorney at the end of interview. He pleaded no contest to second-degree murder, and on April 25, 2022, Gilham was sentenced to a minimum of 23 years in prison for the 1987 murder of Roxanne Wood. Detective John Moore said up until Gilham's arrest, Terry Wood was considered a person of interest. For 35 years, he labored under false assumptions that he murdered his wife. I'd heard stories that at times he'd walk into a place and somebody would call him Slash, said Detective Jason Bailey. Roxanne's brother Brad Woods was only 14 when his sister was murdered. He says he couldn't believe the day when they finally found the guy who killed his rock. It didn't seem real. You know, it was nothing like I had ever played in my mind of how I would be when they came to the door to say, "We've got him." If you enjoyed the video, please show your support by subscribing and liking the video. And turn on all notifications so you don't miss any future uploads.